This program is brought to you by 3C TV. Like what you learned? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up on the latest 3C TV programs.
So I have a basic reason I'm here. And actually, I came here on my own dime. It was really important to me to be here, which is I am concerned about the degree to which the Veterans Summit and the Chancellor's Office has not recognized that a really, really significant element of welcoming and sustaining veterans is to deal with the fact and the truth and the reality that many of them are individuals with disabilities. And I'd really like to see KPED, Disabled Student Services Directors, and all the folks who have traditionally been at the summit get together and address the issue of coordination, address the issue of how we're going to get veterans to make use of disabled student services, and to make this more kind of a seamless, universal design, globally encompassing kind of experience. And the fact that we're sort of in silos here concerns me a great deal. So just a little prologue here. Almost 2.5 million individuals have served in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is actually a really small percentage of the American population and makes us very different from the war in Vietnam or World War II, where a huge percentage of our culture was participating in this experience, and therefore makes our veterans kind of more like a minority group, right? Insular in some ways, with a culture of its own. Almost 550,000 individuals have applied for veterans educational benefits. Nearly 100,000 of them attend college in California, and half of them are coming to our community college system. And there are actually about 2 million vets in California. And this is the figure that I really want to focus on, and I think it's a conservative figure, which is that 40% of our returning Iraq Afghan vets are individuals with disabilities. And I say this as a lawyer, understanding the technical, legal definition of disability. And that definition of disability, by the way, was recently expanded by Congress. And one reason why it was expanded by Congress is because they wanted to cover more veterans. Returning veterans always have an impact on American civil rights. And this is one of the impacts from this current stand down. Okay. A few insights that come in part from my own life, but also come from my experiences in working with veterans. So I'm going to tell you a personal story about my brother, Richard, who in his early 40s was told he was in the terminal stages of cancer. And he thought maybe he had a year to live, and he made a decision. And to me, it's like the strangest, weirdest, certainly not how I would spend my last year on earth. He decided to go to law school. No explaining, right? And he actually made it through law school, passed the New Jersey bar, and shortly thereafter he passed away from his cancer. So I'm sitting with Richard in the hospice, and I'm asking him, did you make the right decision? Terminal, go to law school? And he explained to me something very important that I think applies to our veteran population as well. And he said, as you lose the traditional indicia of being a human being of life, like the ability to walk, his cancer was in his spine, how you go to the bathroom, how you eat, how you make love, all those things that we consider, essential and make us human beings, as long as you can think, as long as you can read and write, as long as you can learn, as long as you can debate and argue, you're still a vital human being. And I just want to remind you, we focus so much on preparing people for employment. Let's get them into the community college, let's get them on the way to a 4-year college because we want them to have jobs. Well, that is important. I fully respect that. But to be honest, having worked with people at the Palo Alto Polytrauma Center, I think there are individuals who, after what's happened to them in Iraq and Afghanistan, they're never going to get a job. They're not going to be employable. But they still can be actualized, vital, rewarded human beings as long as our educational institutions are open to them. And in some ways, I think that's the most honorable purpose of education, is to help people continue to live and be and actualize as human beings. So I just want to cut down to that, bottom purpose. And so many veterans have said to me, Paul, here's what you get that so many other people don't get, which is the education is part of the healing process. You want to know, what to do for veterans to make them transition back to life. It's to give them an equal educational opportunity. So, insight 1. Insight 2, now that I've said, well, they're not all going to get jobs, I'd like to talk for a second about the people who are going to get jobs. So, the government has an interest in seeing to it that they're not paying people unemployment benefits, that people aren't on welfare. Let's make sure that, everybody who can work does work. But I think there's a much more important underlying insight, and that is that we need people with disabilities in the professions. And like it or not, here's a ready source of individuals with disabilities who also have a lot of discipline, who also have a sense of mission, who we can train to be in the professions. And I'll just give you one example because to me, like a light went on when I heard it. A woman by the name of Bonnie Tucker, who later became a famous civil rights lawyer, she had a laryngectomy and had no voice box. And she did not have a laryngectomy. She was deaf. And she became an inhalation therapist working with people who had laryngectomies that because of cancer, they've had their voice box removed. And Bonnie would come onto the ward where she was nursing, and everybody wanted Bonnie as their nurse. And people would talk to Bonnie, and they'd start to cry. And Bonnie didn't get it at first. It's like, well, why are you crying? Why does everybody want me as their nurse? And the answer is because Bonnie was deaf, she understood what they were saying with their lips. And it was not necessary for Bonnie to hear them, to serve them, not only well, but better than any other nurse who could have worked with them. We need people with disabilities in all the professions. But this is particularly true because veterans and wounded warriors come with an exposure to a multicultural society, an exposure to teamwork, an exposure to making decisions in the midst of chaos, all of which makes them more likely to be really competitive individuals in the workplace if we will take the time and effort to educate them. Finally, if you study American civil rights history, one of the things you will find out is that returning veterans always have a big impact on civil rights in America. That was true in the African American civil rights movement. It is true in the Hispanic civil rights movement. And indeed, Korean War veterans and a Korean War veterans organization was really the core of the Hispanic civil rights movement in America. They are the first people who pushed for that. African Americans who were segregated during World War II pushed the federal government to end segregation in defense plants, and President Truman responded to that agitation, responded to those civil rights efforts, and that was really the first federal anti-discrimination law. And I think that's true this time around when we look at the abolition of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, when we look at how strong the GI benefits are. This group of individuals is also going to is going to fight for their civil rights. But nonetheless, one of the things that concerns me when I work with veterans is very few of them have what I would call a civil rights identity. That is to say, when we say, well, why won't they come over to Disabled Student Services? Why won't they take the advantages that they could have, time and a half on exams, whatever it is? And the reason they don't do it is because culturally, they see that as a sign of weakness, right? But if instead, culturally, they saw that as asserting their civil rights, as asserting their constitutionally protected rights, if they were standing up for the Constitution and asking for their rights, that would be a very different perspective, would it not? So I am always trying to get institutions and veteran centers to understand that these individuals have civil rights, which they could be exercising, and indeed, when they exercise them, they may be the tide that raises all boats. Every place on your campus that's inaccessible, that's been inaccessible as long as you can remember, it drives you nuts that that ramp gets put off year after year after year after year. What would happen if it was a group of veterans sitting in front of that inaccessible building demanding their civil rights? I'll bet you that ramp would get built. So they could become civil rights leaders on behalf of their rights as individuals with disabilities. One other thing about these veterans, it's unconstitutional in California, unfortunately, to practice race-conscious affirmative action. It is not unlawful in California to welcome, support, and give advantages to veterans. Half of our veterans are people of color. You want trained people of color to come to your programs. You want people of all races whose parents never went to college. You support veterans, you are supporting diversity without any constitutional implications whatsoever. It's a good way to support diversity in general. Okay. I've been talking a little bit about veterans' assets, but let's talk about them in a little greater depth. Veterans bring what I would call intellectual diversity to your campus. So they have an adult sense of purpose and mission. They have an unequal degree of moral exposure. Does everybody know what that term moral exposure means? It means you've had to make life and death kinds of decisions. You have to decide, am I going to shoot that kid who's approaching my Humvee who may have an IED in them, or am I going to try to save them from the snipers that might shoot them? And the level of moral exposure questions that veterans have to face in their maybe 4 years of service is more than most human beings will have to face in a lifetime. Well, they bring that experience to the classroom. We talk about the importance of diversity in the classroom. This is a form of diversity, moral exposure, what experiences they can bring to the classroom. They have been an eyewitness to our history and our foreign policy. Many surveys have shown that veterans go into the military with a sense of wanting to serve the public. They come out of the military with a sense of wanting to serve the public. Again, the kind of people we'd like to see come into our colleges and be successful in our colleges. We've discussed this point, ethnic diversity without offending the Constitution, unequal leadership training, and oh, by the way, here's a group that comes with their own money. That's a unique situation, right? The best GI Bill and the best benefits since World War II. Now, that's not to say that the GI Bill is perfect. One of the issues that we've discussed already is if a veteran wants to take a reduced course load, they're not going to be able to make it through their whole education just on GI Bill benefits. And maybe this is, the kind of organization that ought to be pushing on Congress to look at these kinds of issues. But nonetheless, they come with more money than anybody else who's ever shown up, right? So it's, on a relative basis, at least a good thing. They bring serious challenges. So one is culture shock. So they are going from unit orientation to kind of an every person for themselves orientation. And I'll give you just one example that one veteran shared with me, because I think it's a really good insight about who would you like in your classroom. So one veteran said to me, every time I go to my math class, I become very anxious. I said, well, why are you anxious about math in particular? And I thought he was going to say, oh, I don't have a good short-term memory for keeping numbers in my head or something of that nature. He said, no, he says, what really makes me anxious is most of the kids aren't prepared. I'm going, well, are you prepared? Yeah. You do your homework? Yeah. So, you know, what makes you anxious? You're going to do better on the exam than everybody else. He says, you don't get it. This unit is going down. And because he's still thinking as a unit, right? He and his buddies together need to all be prepared. So if I was to ask a math professor, you know, what kind of person would you like in your classroom? Somebody who becomes very anxious if everybody isn't doing their homework, or somebody who isn't doing their homework? Well, of course, they'd prefer the former. And this is, you know, an important cultural difference that people have to understand. Many veterans go into the military in part because their family responsibilities are too much to handle. But when they come back, they're going to have to face up to them. And a welcoming college or university is going to be one that's going to take into account the fact that many individuals are in the middle of marital stress or marital dissolution as they are returning to their college experience. They have a cultural need to hide, deny, or postpone weaknesses, including disabilities. If you have a significant disability, you may be kicked out of the military. That may end your military career. So going over to Disabled Student Services is not going to be a natural or easy thing. And they are new to their disabilities. You know, for years and years and years, everybody we had in the California Community College who showed up with a disability had been through the IEP process, through the IDEA process. They had, for better or worse, adjusted to their identity as an individual with a disability. But veterans are new to their disabilities, right? So here you are, you come out of the battlefield, you come into the classroom, and it's not just the difference between the classroom and the battlefield, it's the difference between who you were before you went into the military, who you were when you were in country, and who you are now as an individual with a disability. And I'll just give you, you know, two examples to think about. Most kids who were deaf coming to California Community College System were trained in ASL, right? Now you have a 27-year-old veteran who's lost their hearing, and they may never learn ASL, right? So suddenly real-time captioning becomes a very important accommodation on your campus, and you have to be prepared for the newly acquired disability, which in both cases it may be deafness, but it's lifetime deafness, newly acquired deafness. Same thing for individuals who are blind. I know many individuals, lawyers, who are extremely fluent readers because they read Braille really, really well. Is this 27-year-old coming out of the battlefield going to be Braille proficient? No. You're going to have really well-prepared alternate media. Well, the only way you can have timely alternate media is if your faculty cooperates with you and gets you their syllabi 7 weeks before the start of the semester. And DSS, right, it's not going to happen. Although I could tell you that Berkeley just had a big settlement where that's what they promised. But you're right. And my point is, it's going to take a campus. We can't just put the monkey on the back of Disabled Student Services. And then we have this issue of a civil rights identity, which we've already discussed. So I'm estimating about 40% of veterans are individuals with disability, but I consider that a conservative estimate because I can certainly show you data from organizations like the RAND Corporation or Harvard University or the Department of Defense, which say that TBI and PTSD together is 40% of all veterans. And there are a number of reasons why I think 40% is a conservative number. First of all, we now have war by blast. Not war by bullet, war by blast. And I'm sorry that my video, I couldn't get it to work this afternoon, but here's the thing about a blast. A blast issues a strong blast of air, so that even if it does not rip your Humvee apart, even if it does not force shrapnel into your body, it very easily can take out your hearing. An IED a quarter, half a mile away may take out your hearing. It very easily can shake your head, and so that you have a traumatic brain injury. So this is a particularly, for want of a better word, ugly form of war. And we're going to have a lot of injuries even when people aren't directly in harm's way. Then we have multiple redeployments. And you're supposed to be home twice as long as you are in country in order not to have ever worsening emotional health. But in fact, we had exactly the opposite. You were in country twice as long as you were in home. And we had some veterans who, have been on 4 and 5 deployments. Each time you deploy, the odds of having PTSD or TBI or being shot multiply. So you can start squaring that number out. By the time you get to the 4th deployment, your odds are pretty small that you're not going to be an individual with a disability. And then we have a much higher rate of survival. So we have these medical miracles in the battlefield. 1 person dies for every 14 people who now survive a battlefield injury. That's a pretty high number. In Vietnam, it was 1 in 7. In World War II, it was 1 in 2. But what does this also mean? It means that individuals are going to be much more seriously injured than they were before. And when our campuses receive these individuals, a key component is going to have to be the reality that we may be working with individuals with fairly substantial disabilities. So I know many people think that PTSD, TBI, depression, the so-called cognitive disabilities are the #1 battlefield injury. It's not true. Actually, #1 is loss of hearing. And if you think about it, that's because of the bariotrauma that comes from that explosion pushing that blast of air. Tinnitus is #1, and by the way, tinnitus can be a very serious condition, interfering with your ability to concentrate and work, and all the other hearing impairments together with tinnitus is #1. But #2 is the cognitive ones, and #3 are the orthopedic ones, where mobility impairments come into place, where you have to have an accessible campus. And I have no number for this, but my own guess is it might actually be the true #1. Because why do people volunteer for the military? Well, actually, we even heard this yesterday morning. School and I just didn't get along that well. I wasn't a good fit for college when I was 18 years old. And what's the reason you weren't a good fit for college when you're 18 years old? Because if you have ADHD, you have the maturity of a 13-year-old, and you're not ready for college, right? But when you come back, you have the maturity, but you also still have your disability. How am I doing for time, Mary Lee? We're okay. All right. Failure to address the fact that 40% or more of our students are individuals with disabilities is not going to work. We're just sticking our head in the sand if we don't make this a very important factor. So other challenges that go along with this disability is veterans don't use our communication channels, right? They use social media, and they are often only communicating with other veterans, or maybe even just other individuals who were in their unit when they were serving overseas. So we can't reach to them in the traditional ways. They present us with a new range of disabilities, and we've talked about that briefly because they're acquired disabilities, right? So even though we've had experience with deaf students, it's not the same deaf students as we've had our experience with. And another challenge is, the one that I worked on for 40 years is to comply with the law, a range of rights must be addressed. And I'm going to go into these in more detail in just a minute, but just to summarize them, first there's the right to equal treatment, simply not be discriminated against in the old-fashioned sense, purposefully on the basis of disability. The right to accommodation, and by the way, this is not a technically correct word, and I'm going to get into the right terms in a second or two. Access, so here I'm speaking about, are your buildings accessible? Is your eating area accessible? Is your football stadium accessible? Is your gym accessible? We'll get into that a little bit more. Emotional and health support, and that might be something that you have on campus, but if it's something you don't have on campus, then at least I hope you have a good referral system and you know where people can be referred to. And then, I hate to be a hard ass about this, but you need a good conduct system because you are going to have conduct issues, and when you process people in conduct, you want to give them full, proper, due process. Otherwise, you may be guilty of disability discrimination. So this is not an easy area to handle, and you need to be prepared for this element as well. So let's go legal for just a second. So as individuals with disabilities, veterans have civil rights. They have rights under state law, and they have rights under federal law. And the two federal laws that matter the most are Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which every single California community college is subject to. And that law pertains to every single program or activity on your campus. There are no exceptions. This is not just about academic programs. This could be about your weight training center. I don't care. It's every single program. And if noncompliance were to be found to exist after a hearing, after a due process hearing, every federal dollar you receive would be in jeopardy. Not just the ones going to the program where the violation was found. Every single dime that you get from the federal government would be in jeopardy. So if you have a professor who doesn't want to implement an accommodation you approved, you might just remind that professor how popular they're going to be when every single federal dollar is cut off because of their refusal to provide an accommodation. And then the other important law is Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which applies to every single community college as well. Title II is stronger than Section 504 with regard to what is called sensory impairments. So those are individuals who are deaf, hard of hearing, blind, or low vision. There are even greater protections under the ADA than under Section 504. And these laws are not just the responsibility of Disabled Student Services. And I know your campuses often think that way, right? And they can't, because you alone, Disabled Student Services alone, cannot achieve compliance with these laws. So let's hit the equal treatment leg of this, first of all. So if you are an individual with a disability, if you're a veteran with a disability, you are entitled to non-discrimination under these laws, even if you do not register with Disabled Student Services. So what does equal treatment entitle you to? Well, first of all, you cannot be excluded from admission to a program just because you're an individual with a disability. And so programs can have qualifications, and it's possible that because of your disability, you can't meet that qualification. But it can't be just because you have a particular named disability number one, and before they decide whether you can or cannot meet the qualification, they must take into account reasonable accommodation. So if a nursing program has a rule that you have to lift 50 pounds, the rule is, can you lift 50 pounds with reasonable accommodation? Okay? And that is just non-discrimination. Hostile environment on the basis of disability. Unfortunately, we all know that some professors pick on students who they know to be veterans, right? They single them out, they ask them difficult questions, they ask them inappropriate questions. Well, just like there's a hostile environment on the basis of race or sex or national origin, there is such a thing as a hostile environment on the basis of disability. And again, you do not need to be registered with DSS to assert your right to be free of a hostile environment on the basis of disability. Yes? So that's a really difficult question, and I can't answer it in the theoretical, but I will point out the fact that it's not a poli-sci class, and this is getting raised. If it's done to get the attention of the veteran, you may have a hostile environment on the basis of disability. But it's worth noting that that veteran is entitled to file a complaint and have an investigation of that very issue. Obviously, there's a lot of academic freedom, First Amendment protections for faculty, but if it's irrelevant to the course and the faculty individual was only going into it when that veteran was there, you gotta ask, is this kind of a personal attack and creating a hostile environment for that veteran? And you raise a good point, is that there is remedying discrimination which would readily allow you to move that veteran, but there's also reasonable accommodation, which is another basis to move that individuals. Okay. Attending a physically accessible campus, and just one quick thing I want to say about this. You know, you have buildings that were built a long time ago, and sometimes that's the excuse for not making them accessible. So I just want to clear up this point. Any building built after 1979, that's a while ago now, right, must be accessible. Okay? Now, you may have buildings that were built before 1979, so let's talk about them for a second. Whatever program you have in those buildings, you're going to have to move to another building if a veteran wants to participate in that program. So here's the trick that I used to do when I worked for OCR. I'd go on campus, and I'd find out that the English department was in this beautiful, beautiful old building, built like in, 1876 or whatever. And I'd go into the building, and I'd ask one of the English professors, so if you had a veteran show up in a wheelchair and they couldn't get into the building, who would you call to move your class? Say what? Who would you call to move your class? And then I asked the veteran, did anybody tell you at DSS or elsewhere or in the handbook, if you have a class in an inaccessible building, call this person and they'll fix the problem? No. And then I look in your handbook and there is no such person. If you don't have someone with the authority to move that class, the building might not be in violation of the law, but the program is in violation of the law because it's not accessible to individuals with disabilities. So I urge you on every campus to have your ADA officer, who you're supposed to have under the ADA, actually know this is one of their responsibilities and actually publish this fact so that people know if there's a program in an inaccessible building which doesn't have to be made accessible, then this person has the authority to move that class and do so immediately. They have the right to bring service animals on campus, and we don't have time today to go into the issue of service animals, which actually could be the subject of a full hour presentation. But I just want to tell you, OCR worked with many campuses where they had this thing where you bring your documentation to DSS and then you get permission to bring your service animal on campus. And at the time, OCR's advice was good. It is no longer correct. Tear up the plan that OCR wrote with you. Because now, if it's a true service animal, which is essentially a dog that is trained for the purpose of assisting the veteran, and the dog does something in response to something the veteran does or needs, so you can identify. So it's not passive. It's not just, you're my buddy, right? It's an act. It could be guiding, right? It could be pulling. It could be retrieving. It could be nipping on your fingers because you're starting to have a seizure. It could be any number of things. But it's got to be a dog. It's got to react to something, and it's got to actually do something. If that's the kind of service animal you have, you do not require them to register with DSS, and you train your protection and security people hands off. Unless, of course, the animal's out of control. That's a different question. Then, let me just finish the paradigm, and then I'll get to your question. Then, on top of that, you have a whole nother kind of animal called a companion animal or a comfort animal. So this is an animal who doesn't do anything. It's their existence. It is their being at your side. It's being part of your unit that makes them valuable. Right now, the only time that is legally required is in dorms. And if you don't have a dorm, currently you have no requirement to admit companion animals. And by the way, if you have a dorm, a companion animal can be pretty much anything but a reptile. But other than reptiles, you know, ferrets or gerbils or whatever, cats. But to get that is an accommodation. And for that, you have to go through Disabled Student Services, and for that, you have to document your need for it. So the perfect documentation is, I'm the treating physician for this individual. This individual has PTS. This individual is medicated at half the level that they would have to be medicated at if they didn't have their pet gerbil with them or their pet ferret with them. That's a really good example of when you would be entitled to that. But so I'm making a big distinction between the companion animal and the service animal. So here's the unanswered question. Eventually, will OCR require companion animals as an accommodation in the classroom? And my answer is stay tuned, because I don't know the answer yet.
So my question is, that hasn't been an issue in the past because there may have been just one service animal or one companion animal
Right.
in our ERC. But now we've really promoted service animals because we've brought in speakers and people who train them. And so now I'm seeing up to sometimes 3, maybe even 4 service animals in a very small space. I know you're not allowed to ask them if it's a service animal.
They do have to control them.
They do have to control them. But my problem, and I love dogs, my problem is when other people start playing with the dogs. And at that point, I usually say, if it's a service or a companion animal, it's supposed to be focused on you. When you start playing with them, or other people start playing with them, then it becomes a pet.
Yeah. Part of control is not having other people play with your animal. So I could come back next year and do 2 hours on service animals, but I'm getting behind, so I'm going to push a little bit. The ability to bring wheelchairs and scooters on campus, again, you should not have to go through Disabled Student Services. The ability to bring OPMs and EPMDs, that's different. So what are those? Those are devices that were not designed for people with disabilities, but people with disabilities like them for mobility, like a Segway. So you're allowed to have safety rules around those kinds of things like a Segway. So a Segway goes 4 times as fast as a scooter. So you may tell people you can bring a Safeway into this area of campus, but not this area of campus, or you can bring it on during these hours, but not these hours, or you can bring your Segway anywhere, but you can't make it go over 2 miles an hour, things of that nature. So then we get into academic adjustments. A common one and a good one that I recommend is modification of course load and time to degree, even though that does screw your benefits. Exam modifications like extra time on exams. And here's one that there's a lot of debate going on about right now, which is memory assistance, right? Can you bring your notes into class? And I'm going to talk about that in just a second. Course and assignment substitutions. And auxiliary aids, which are interpreters and real-time captioners, Braille and alternate media, note takers, and adaptive technology. So academic adjustments and auxiliary aids together are commonly called reasonable accommodations. And I said reasonable accommodations is really not the right word. Those are the technically correct words. But I'm going to use this word reasonable accommodation because I want to make clear what a reasonable accommodation is or is not. A reasonable accommodation does not mean reasonable in the eyes of the average faculty member. That is not what the modifier reasonable means. Reasonable means necessary, not a fundamental alteration in the nature of the program, not an undue burden, not a personal device, and in engaging in this accommodation, the person does not represent a direct threat to the health and safety of others. But if you're none of these nots, and it is necessary, it is a reasonable accommodation, even though the visiting professor from Czechoslovakia may not think so. Okay, what is it going to take to attract and retain these students? Well, it's not going to be business as usual. It's going to be recognition from the top and robust recognition at that we respect veterans and what they have done and what they can do. It's going to be campus-wide collaboration on and off campus, robust and innovative accommodations, and universal design. And Dr. Vance is going to talk about universal design in just a minute. So we've talked about buildings being accessible ever since 1969, I would like to remind you. It was also going to take readily available mental health services, a strong discipline system, and I strongly recommend a feedback and complaint system for veterans. Let them tell you how well you're doing. Let them tell you what it was that made transition feasible for them and what was the biggest barrier to transition. I want to strongly recommend an in-service program for faculty, one that you require all your faculty to attend. Imagine that. And like we did yesterday, I'd like to see it presented by a panel of veterans with a knowledgeable person who's kind of guiding them through that in-service program. And of course, I want the faculty to know about what is TBI, what is PTSD, how many veterans may have hearing losses, what kind of accommodations they're entitled to, what is their culture about. And then I'd like to see a campus-wide interdisciplinary committee, and I want to see on it disabled student services, veteran services, but I want you to just quickly look at this list. How many different services come into play, your protection and security. So let me just give you an example of one you may not have thought about, your athletic and entertainment event services. Well, there happen to be some pretty strong rules about seating for individuals with disabilities at those events. Veterans need to use your weight training center. I'd like to encourage you to go over to your weight training center and see if somebody could run a scooter between the equipment over there, or how much of the equipment is universal design equipment. I want you to review your policies, and among them, the #1 issue for veterans is transfer and granting of credit for military service. When ACE did its Veterans Jam, that was the #1 issue that they raised. Adding, dropping, and withdrawing from classes, particularly because they could get called up for service again, or their PTSD could get bad, or they can find out that the professor is a problem. So let me explain a really important point about reasonable accommodation. It is not giving the veteran the benefit of the existing rules. It is giving the individual with a disability an exception to the existing rule. So your rule says you must drop by the 3rd week, or you will get an F, or you will get an incomplete. And so a veteran comes in the 5th week, and you say, well, I'm sorry, but the rule is week 3. The veteran is asking you as an accommodation to make an exception to that rule. And the fact that it's a rule doesn't mean that it will be a fundamental alteration to make the exception. You have to think about whether it is or is not a fundamental alteration, and if it's not, you need to make an exception to the rule, because just letting the veteran play by the same rules as everybody else is not an accommodation. That's just equal treatment. I'm talking about accommodations. You need rules about bringing on personal attendants. So you don't provide the personal attendant, but you're going to need to have a policy about the personal attendant. My favorite rule is your mother can't take the exam for you, right? On the other hand, if your mother is a responsible individual, yes, we will make room for her in the classroom even though she's not a registered student, right? You have to have a strong disciplinary code. You have to have a drug and alcohol abuse system. Suicide prevention, you don't have to run that program, but you sure as heck need to know where to refer individuals and what to do in case of concerns about suicide. Use and control of service and companion animals for just the reasons we've talked about. And then I'd like to see veteran-centric programs, a student orientation for veterans. They do this at San Diego State University, and it's been very helpful. They even have a veterans freshman-sophomore dorm there. And again, very helpful. Their grade point average and their persistence to graduation rate is higher than it is for non-veterans, which is an exceptional situation because they have so many vet-centric supportive programs. So these efforts can pay off. A one-stop shop for all your veteran services. We certainly heard that from the veterans yesterday morning. Some Wounded Warrior veteran service member only classes. Maybe your first year English class is a good place so that they can meet one another, so they know who one another is, so you know who they are. Late registration and late drop privileges, campus events honoring veterans, athletic and strength training activities for veterans, housing programs for veterans, and then a service center that's a veteran center. So I agree that it's important that you have somebody in your campus that can help veterans get their financial aid, right? It's important that you have somebody in campus who can advise veterans what courses they need to take, what credits they're going to get. But to me, that's not the most important reason you want to have a veteran center. The most important reason you want to have a veteran center is because the best source of support for veterans is other veterans. If you have a veteran who's going through a PTSD breakdown, what you want to be able to do is call over to the Veterans Center, because you know there'll be a buddy over there who can come over and help this individual through that particular crisis. A good Veterans Center produces leaders. First, they're president of the Vet Center, and then they're president of the student body. That's what a successful Veterans Center looks like. And of all the things that you can do to support veterans on your campus, I think that is the first, most important, number one thing to do. And by the way, if you make the space, it ain't that hard to fill it, because your local VFW and your local SVA and your local Pontiac dealership, all these old things, right? They will supply the icebox, the pizzas, the TVs. So get the space and get a good space, and from there you can build a good vets center. Then I think you have to have off-campus outreach, and the only one I want to talk about, because I want to turn the mic over to Dr. Vance in a second, is working with your local VA center, right? Because your disabled student services and your vet services has to be coordinated with your local VA. And by the way, if you can get the VA to come on campus and provide services on campus, that's a very successful model. And many individuals who won't go to the VA will get to the services if you put them on your campuses. So how do we get wounded warriors to use their rights? Well, I think disabled student services has to be told who the veterans are. I think disabled student services has to come to the vet center, not invite people to them. Come to the vet center. Then I think we have to recast the services. Instead of saying these are reasonable accommodations, let's say these are services to maximize your academic performance. You know, veterans are into doing their best. They're not into being fixed, helped, or repaired. So let's recast this. Veterans are more comfortable with assistive technology than any other accommodation. So rather than just having the assistive technology in the Disabled Student Services office, let's have the assistive technology in the Veterans Center. Let's get them using it there, become familiar with it there. Let's change the name of Disabled Student Services. Maybe it'll be Access Services. Maybe we have to change the location so that the Veterans Resource Center and Disabled Student Services Center are very close to one another. Let's work on the documentation requirements. Let's not make documentation so hard to do. And by the way, there's new guidance from the Justice Department on documentation of disability. There's nothing wrong with giving a temporary accommodation while you're giving a veteran time to get that information. And the veteran's self-report of what happened to them and what accommodations they might need is a valuable source of information on that. And finally, I'd like to redesign the vet. I would like them to have a civil rights identity so that they see themselves not as getting an advantage, they see themselves as asserting their civil rights. And the ultimate solution, I think, is universal design, and I'm going to turn over to my universal design expert.
I was at a national conference in early October. I'm not going to tell you the name of the profession because it would be very embarrassing. But I did the slide up there, no one cracked a smile. But when I've gone to veteran stand-downs, was kind of embarrassing at first because I go there with my scooter and the vets parked like the Red Sea, and they see me coming, going, "Oh, yeah, I can't believe you're here." And I'm going, "Why not?" And I realized, oh my God, I'm in Indiana. All right, okay. So I'm not Tammy Duckworth. I get to stand by the Black Hawk, but nothing beyond that point. She uses a wheelchair. She pushes herself. I don't. She's a paraplegic. She's honorably discharged. I'm not. But anyway, it was fun when I watched 5 National Guardsmen lift my scooter up to load it in the Chinook 47. It was a great ride. It was so boring. And the pilot looked at me and says, "Is this boring?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "Okay, so I'll give it." He did a couple of swoops just for me. It was so much fun. Anyway, that was my reward for the National Guard. I was just going to tell you that when I moved to Montana, I was in Wisconsin, and I was moving to Montana, a 3-day drive. They gave me a couple cases of MREs just in case I might get lost. They are so sweet. So let me just tell you a little bit about academic advisement adjustments, accommodations, advisement tips, whatever. I'm going to talk really fast. I talk fast anyway, but when you got to follow Dr. Grossman here, you got to talk faster. The thing I really want you to go away with, this is the big takeaway, is recognizing, understand the distinctions between academic adjustments and academic accommodations, all right? And Paul went through that just very briefly. Accommodations becomes very legal. Accommodations becomes a case of civil rights. It's something that the Disability Services Office is authorized to do. They are the ones that will say, yes, your comfort animal qualifies to live underneath the FHA in the residence hall, blah, 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 blah. Academic adjustments are faculty owned and governed. Faculty Senate determines the academic integrity of the courses and the curriculum and the degree requirements. Faculty within each classroom have the right and the ability to determine how they are going to teach, how they will assess, and how they're going to go about making sure that the students are learning. Now, if you are a faculty member and your students are not learning, there is something wrong here. Your teaching pedagogy needs to be changed and altered accordingly. One of the things that we discovered when Wayne and I did our research early on regarding campuses, disability service providers, and their level of understanding of what was going on campus. We surveyed the disability service providers to find out what were their #1 accommodations and disabilities identified by wounded warriors. And what we found was really interesting. Along with the PTSD and the TBI and the orthopedic, blah, 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 we discovered that the 3rd and 4th highest disability identified by both male and female was learning disability. The thing that was unique about that was we didn't expect it to be so high. But when you start looking at the classroom, when you start looking at what's happening with veterans and their academic retention, now you see how critical it is that faculty get engaged and recognize their level of responsibility. The university sells degrees. The product is what the faculty do. If the students are not gaining access to what they were promised when they were enlisted, then we have failed. And so this is why it's so important that we understand that the faculty have the right to determine how they're going to teach, how they're going to assess, and how they're going to ensure the students are learning. And so they can determine whether or not the quiz is going to be open book. They can determine that rather than having timed tests, you're going to have some other mode of delivery regarding how to express and to demonstrate your competency in the curriculum. They can do that without disability services writing the legal prescription on what the student requires. And if they do that, then the veteran does not have to go through the torture and ordeal of providing the appropriate documentation that the Disability Services Office is traditionally used to receiving, which, as you well know, the VA does not do. So therefore, also, you have veterans who will never identify. We know that there are veterans who go to school and they have no reason and no desire to self-identify to anybody. But yet they're enrolled in a class, and if they can't hear and they can't see and they can't do the testing, they're going to quietly leave. And now we lost them. And I don't know about you, but everywhere I've been, retention has always been a big issue. In general, retention is an issue. We're now learning that it's very expensive to have students being recruited in and then leaving. And when you bring in a veteran, and especially one that's got the GI Bill, you don't really want to lose them. And they're not going to necessarily tell you, oh, I stopped going to class because I couldn't see. Or they always play these video clips and I couldn't hear. They're not going to tell you that. They're just going to kind of slide away. So the intent of universal design is the intent of making it as accessible to everybody as possible. Why would you build a church or a grocery store that somebody is not able to access? And the unique thing is curb cuts were not designed for scooters. Electronic door openers at grocery stores are not designed for people with disabilities. It was designed for drainage. It was designed for, if you have an armful of groceries, you're going to be able to buy more with a shopping cart if you can go through an electronic door than having to figure out how to open up the grocery store door with your one bag of groceries. So of course they want you to push out the shopping cart, build a grocery. So, but people with disabilities like myself benefit. So this is the definition of universal design. When you are looking at presentations, when faculty are thinking about how to teach, one of the things I have done in my role as a disability services director has been challenging faculty, because they'll say things like, this is required for the curriculum. And then I have to challenge them and ask them, is that the only way that it can be taught? Is that the only way it can be assessed? Because if it can be changed, then you need to do that. Because if it can't be changed, I will defend you. But if my student files an OCR complaint, and OCR comes in and says, you're in violation, I said, I will be really mad that you embarrassed me too. You know, so let's work together, let's figure this out. And so then they have curriculum, how can I present this information without compromising? Again, reasonable accommodation, universal design, it's not about corrupting the integrity of the course. It's about working with the integrity of the curriculum, but also designing it so that it is accessible. So if I'm deaf, I'm absolutely not going to get advantage of the YouTube clip like all the other students. But it's not cheating. It's not disrupting the integrity of the curriculum if you gave me the text or if you interpret it for me. Because the whole essence is I should be trying to learn what it is you're trying to teach me. And so you need to provide that for me. And, you know, so there's a 4-step model here. What does a task assignment require? Very simple question. What physical, sensory, and cognitive skills are needed? What components of the task require accommodation? What accommodation options exist? So when you look at the task and assignment required, for example, faculty, and I'll give you a class example. If I was a quadriplegic and unable to move beyond a joystick to get anything done in terms of movement, and I sign up for a basic general health course, and one of the things that the faculty wants to do is include the ability to be certified in CPR. But the course really is about learning how to appreciate CPR and to develop knowledge of your general body and functions, blah, blah, blah. But getting in the certificate process is an extra. So this is where you have to challenge the instructor and say, is this really integral, or is this something you really just added in because you thought it'd be nice? And the faculty is going to argue that this is important to the integrity. And I'll just ask you a hypothetical question. So if I were a quadriplegic and I come into your health class and you want to teach this particular course and part of it requires CPR, and you know what that means. You have to get down on the floor, you have to beat the hell out of the dummy and break a couple of ribs, or you didn't do it right? So do I have a right as a quadriplegic to pass that course because you built that in as a requirement? If I'm a quadriplegic, cannot do the CPR. Do I have a right because I have a disability to pass that course? Does that make sense? Really? No. Because I didn't pass the essential requirements for the certificate process. So with a licensure and the certificate, that is a requirement that I be able to perform those essential functions. However, the course, is that a requirement for the course? And could I demonstrate my knowledge and competency of how to do CPR? Could I possibly instruct somebody else to actually do the CPR for me? Would I still be able to pass the course? I should be able to. So that is one of the examples of a challenge that instructors need to be analyzing, that you can help in that role. Because DSS alone, one little office, or how many people that you have on your campus, cannot do this alone. But all of you are required. It takes a village. I tell people it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a campus to graduate a student. It truly does. It takes everybody. So simple inclusive statement, when you look at the syllabi, and I can go through another whole presentation on nothing but how to develop a university designed syllabi so that faculty are thinking proactively, not reactively. What happens is faculty get really, really ticked when they have put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, usually the week before classes start, in terms of what the book is going to be and what the class syllabi is going to be and the points, this and that, whatever. And then along about the third week or later on or who knows when, someone comes along and says, oops, guess what? I'm going to need to have an interpreter. I'm going to need to have this or that. And you've planned your whole curriculum on being able to show Comedy Central's latest flick the night before, the next day for class. And now you're not going to be able to do that because in the law, you're not going to be able to provide equal access to all your students, in a timely manner, because that one student's not going to be able to access it because it needs to be captioned. And you need to have time to be able to do all that, right? So what you need to do is you need to develop a syllabi that builds in that level of flexibility so that when the student does come in that says, I need to have a certain requirement, that you've already built in the flexibility to be able to provide that, or better yet, don't even think about showing a video unless it's already been captioned. Or you have a plan in place so that if it's being shows Thursday night, you don't show it till the following Monday, and you get an agreement with whoever that it's going to be captioned immediately. I mean, a couple of days delay is not going to kill you, but you need to make sure that the faculty plan ahead. So the advantages of UD, number one, are when you think about a veteran, they have enough on their minds anyway. They do not need to feel responsible for inconveniencing anybody. They do not need to feel any kind of emotions, anything other than my job, my mission is to go to college and to gain my degree, to achieve my degree. So when you have a UD mentality in a universal divine environment, you don't need to be worrying about having a separate process of retroaction or anything like that. When you have a UD environment, the responsibility for access becomes the responsibility of the university, not the student. When I went to college before the ADA. I thought it was my responsibility, and it was my responsibility, to call up facilities. And in the Midwest, I know you guys are California, but in the Midwest, it snows. So, I would have to call up facilities at 7:30 in the morning and say, would you please shovel a pathway from my residence hall room to X building, which is where my 8 a.m. class is, so that I could have that access. And then I would count on the fact that while I was in class, they would shovel the rest of my campus so I could get to my next class, But it was my responsibility then. It should not be. And then the accessibility standards are integrated during the design process rather than as an afterthought. The individual with disabilities does not have to continually advocate. I should not have to remind you, please caption this video. Oh, by the way, that's kind of hard to read, And we know that, I hate to say it, none of us are getting younger. We're all going to get a disability of some sort. We're going to start to fumble around. Our brains are getting a little softer. Our eyes are getting a little weaker. Our hearing is getting a little bit bad. Guess what? the revenue coming in from senior citizens, retired individuals, the non-traditional age, that's growing. That's important to know that we provide that access up front. Accessibility is built in and does not need to be readdressed each and every time. One of the irking things when I was in disability services was I would have to provide for Paul over here a CD of a book in audio format for him, for Biology 100. Then you come along the next semester, you got that same biology class 100, I'd have to go do the whole thing for you. Why couldn't I use that same CD and just give it to you? There were copyright issues. There's a lot of things that are going on then that were preventing us from being able to have that share process and to be thinking long-term pictures, not just, oh, it's going to be Paul. It might be another student along the way who could also benefit from that same accommodation. So within advising and teaching, you know, there are certain things that faculty need to think about, and that is their mode of teaching may not always be the same. You need to, maybe asynchronous is going to be the best way. Some veterans are going to benefit from distance education and other ways of learning. Advisors' offices and faculty offices, I mean, faculty and advisors have said to me many times, oh, X student won't come to my office. You know, I've got a scooter. And if I look in the doorway and I see that I can't get in without smashing your furniture, denting things and whatever, I'm not going to come in. I'm not going to feel welcome. And even at a conference like this, I mean, I kind of nose in and I kind of look around. I'm going, where's my best parking spot, you know? Those are strategic things that people who are aware of their limitations or aware of what they need to be comfortable are looking out for. And if it's not available, they're not going to necessarily tell you. They just won't come in. They just won't do it. Self-advocacy skills can be encouraged, especially for faculty. They need to understand this. They need to understand it's not about, let me do this for you. It's about, what can I do to learn what needs to be done to get this process of learning and assessment working? Advisement is teaching outside the classroom. You all, maybe, you know, I know in California, the word counselors use a lot. In other states, the word advisors use. But whatever way it is, if you're not in the classroom as faculty, what you do in your role, respectively, everything you do, you're teaching. You all have a role teaching. You're teaching students how to do certain things. You're teaching them how to navigate other areas. So you have a very important role, and so that's why I say advisement is teaching outside the classroom. So here we go about adjustments. These are classroom adjustments. These are things that faculty own and control and can do. They do not need DSS. DSS should not have to be involved with providing this kind of access. This is something that faculty should be trained, they should be educated on, and they should learn. This is what they should automatically do up front when they develop their syllabi and when they start doing the course planning. They should have their syllabi ready in advance. I'm a faculty member. I've taught graduate and undergraduate courses. I know what it's like to be tweaking my syllabi the day before classes start. I know what it's like to be tweaking my syllabi even while after classes started. But you got to at least have your textbook. You got to at least have a general idea of what the curriculum is going to involve so that the student who does require YouTube clips or the book or whatever else to be academically altered, adjusted, can have that done in a timely manner. And captioning literally takes an hour of time to get 1 minute video captioned, okay? So that's really the ratio, and that's different than subtitles. So subtitles is just, you know, blah, 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 little text at the bottom, you know, like what you see on CNN. But captioning is they're playing this music. Now you hear this. Now this is what's going on. And they spell it all out for you. So captioning, if somebody needs captioning, you nearly have to figure out a ratio of 1 minute per an hour per time. So eliminate time tests and other assessments. I've had faculty come to me and say, well, I have a student who doesn't speak English, so can I give him extra time? And I'll say, you know what? Not being a native English speaker is not a disability. However, would you do that for all the other students who are not native speakers? Well, not really. And I'll say, but why not? If you want to do it for X student, why don't you want to do it for the other student? And come to think of it, what's the whole point of having a timed exam if you're willing to do it for this one student? Why not just eliminate this whole time process in general? you know, and it causes them to stand back and think and say, why indeed, you know, because if it's that, if you're willing so much to do that for the one student, then you really do need to question what is the need for you to have time tests for everybody else. And if you said, I won't give time tests for the entire class, then that is a universal design. That's access for everybody. And one of the things that you can keep in mind thinking about math and think about other classes, faculty sometimes will say, well, I can't give this person unlimited time or whatever. And I'll say, okay, let me ask you this. If you really don't know the math, the assignment, and you put me in a corner somewhere with a chair and by myself, if I get to sit there for 3 years, will I perform better than someone else who's just given time and a half, do you think, if I don't know the content? And the answer, of course, is no. So what does it matter? Give me my time and a half, you know? Because if you don't know the content, you're not going to do better with more time. You either know it or you don't. It just, but because of your disability, it may be that your motor skills, your way of thinking, you're going to need that extra time and a half. So think logically about it. Either you know it, but it takes you longer to be able to demonstrate it, or you don't know it. And what are we really trying to assess? Your ability to do it within a time frame, or your ability to demonstrate knowledge of the course? So that's what we're trying to assess. Okay, yes. So you're not alone. When it worries, may not ask. And that's one thing the students have always said to me. They will always say, ma'am, no, we would never ask. But if it's there, we'll use it. If I know about it, I'll use it. And they want to be able to use what's available. But they're not going to necessarily ask. They're not going to express a weakness or limitation. And again, they may never make it to a disability services office. And that's why it's so critical to think about the difference in how the wars have changed how we educate. We know that World War II, the GI Bill opened up the whole campus and higher ed field by bringing in women, students of color, different economic groups. This war is providing us a unique opportunity to change the landscape of how we educate and how we assess. We can now use, I hate to say it, the veterans, to change how we teach. It's about time we started to acknowledge that the way we teach is not necessarily reaching out to our student body. And when you look at the history of retention in general before this war, and now you think about where we are economically in the war and the future of higher education, you now realize that the future and the landscape of higher education must change. And part of that process is working with the veterans to find out and understand how we can help them with their new mission, which is to get their bachelor's degree. So it's important to collaborate with the Student Services Office and with other people. So these guys, when they were at the last stand down I was at, were like rock stars. Everybody was coming up there literally asking for their autograph. I don't have a picture of him, but I go to the fitness center on my campus. There's a 93-year-old World War II vet that every morning at 5 a.m. is there when the place opens up, and he's on the cardio machines, pumping away. There are mornings I get up at 6 o'clock, I drag my little body there, and I'm going like, I don't want to go. But when I get there, Bill is sitting there going, well, there she is, it's about time. You know, he's a funny little guy, but you know, those are the rock stars. And I was at a pierogi fest, you know, the little Polish dumpling thingies. They have a festival for pierogies. Anyway, it's big in Indiana. It really is, you know? Anyway, I love the T-shirt. Shh, I'm hiding from the voices. And I asked the man, I said, do you mind if I take your shirt? He said, not at all, you know, so that was cute. So I did have case studies, but I think we're running out of time. I think what Paul and I would like to do right now is have you ask us questions if you have anything, and we're more than glad to stay a little bit behind.
So we'll stay after to answer questions, but just I want to wrap up for those who've got it.
Yes, appreciate your attention.
So I just want to wrap up in this way. In a month, my new textbook will be published, and it will be in 3 formats. It will be in a hardcover, a loose leaf, so somebody who can't carry that big heavy textbook can just tear out a few pages and mark it up, and it'll be in electronic format. So if you're blind, you don't have to have somebody convert that book. It'll already be there. If you come to my class at Hastings, every single one of my classes is recorded. You'll get the PowerPoint before that class ever takes place. You'll get the full and final version of the syllabus before the semester is. When you take your final exam, it's untimed, 3,000-word limit. can't write me one more, I won't read one word beyond the 3,000th word, but you can have whatever time you need. I tell students, my contract ends in July, you gotta get it to me before my contract ends each year, but other than that, I don't care when you turn it into me. What's my point? Twofold. One is, you don't have to go to DSS to come to my class, because my class is a universal design class, right? But here's the bigger point. I'm a better teacher. Hastings is a better institution, because the biggest engine for innovation in teaching is students with disabilities, right? And when we think about the burdens and the challenges and the inconveniences, we also ought to be thinking about what unique assets do they bring to our community colleges? What is it uniquely that we can do for them that sudden employment will not be doing for them, only education will be doing for them? And then what do they do for us to improve how we deliver education, right? A famous entrepreneur said, education is the only business in which the customer is always wrong. Right? Well, I think our veterans are going to try to make us responsible to the customer, right? And I think that's a very important innovation. So we're going to stay.
One more.
Much for your time.
I'm going to put in one more shameless plug. Paul wrote the seminal chapter for the book that I have just finished lead editing, which is in its final stages before it goes to galley and will be published in March. And this book will be distributed free to all, I think they're called institutional members of NASPA, the National Association of Professional, no, not advisors, Nationals, I should know, I'm a member. National Association of Student Personnel Administrators. Yes. Got it. Okay, so it's housing, it's dining services, there's all these other areas, and it also has a chapter in there about Wounded Warriors by John Mickelson, who some of you may be recognizing that name, and it's called Beyond the ADA. It's trying to get the campus mobilized and to move beyond ADA as being the base. And so in essence, ADA to me is being a C-average student. When people say we're trying to get ADA compliance, it's like you just want to get a C to pass the course. But you want to be at an A or B, at least B, but certainly A level. That's a universal design principle. That's a process of having the campus be accessible to everybody without having to ask that question, do you really need that curb cut or elevator? You know, not having to have that special situation. And I remember going to conferences where they would literally pull out the ramp just for my conference and just for me. And then after the conference, I watched them take that portable ramp and put it away. No one else needed it except me, I guess. But that's not the world we should have. We should have something where it's accessible for everybody. So it's called Beyond the ADA. I would say check with your student personnel administrators to make sure that in March they have their copy of the book. If they don't have it, then they should get a copy of it. It's cheaper than Paul's book.
Don't buy my book if you're not going to law school. But
right.
Then ask for the book.
Okay, any questions? Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.